My daughter-in-law left a voicemail on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the backyard deadheading my roses when my phone buzzed against the patio table. I listened to it twice, standing right there in the dirt, gardening gloves still on, before I went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and just stayed there for a while. She said, and I'm paraphrasing because I've since deleted it, "We've decided it would be best if you weren't at Thanksgiving this year. Or Christmas. We need space, and honestly, Sandra, the kids are picking up on the tension. It's not healthy for anyone. I hope you understand. I hope you understand." I texted my son one sentence, understood. Then I called my attorney. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning because none of this makes sense without it. My son. I'll call him by his middle name here, which is what I called him when he was in trouble as a boy. Adrian. Adrian was born 29 years ago in a hospital in Columbus, Ohio, during the worst ice storm the city had seen in a decade. His father and I drove 40 minutes on black ice to get there, and I remember thinking, this child is already making things difficult? And I laughed through a contraction. He was stubborn from the start. Beautiful and stubborn. His father, Raymond, died when Adrian was 11. Pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end, which sounds like enough time but never is. After that, it was just the two of us in that house in Clintonville. Me, Adrian, and whatever was left of the life we built as a family of 3. I went back to work full-time. I had been a part-time bookkeeper for a small dental practice before Raymond got sick. But part-time doesn't pay a mortgage, and I had a son to raise. So I took on more clients. Then more. I built a small accounting business out of our spare bedroom, and for about 7 years, that spare bedroom smelled like coffee and printer ink and quiet desperation. Adrian was a good kid. He really was. He grieved his father the way 11-year-old boys do, by not talking about it at all, and then occasionally crying in the shower when he thought I couldn't hear. I always heard. I never said anything. Some things a mother learns to let be. He was smart. Got into Ohio State on a partial academic scholarship, studied business. I covered the rest, tuition, room and board, the occasional emergency phone call that started with, "Mom, I know this is bad timing, but," I didn't mind. That's what you do. You work so your child can go further than you did. That was the whole point of all of it. After graduation, he moved to Chicago. Got a job at a logistics firm, entry level, worked his way up. Called me every Sunday for about 2 years. Then every other Sunday. Then, when he remembered, I told myself that was normal. Young people get busy. They build their own lives. That's the goal, Sandra. That's what you raised him to do. He met his wife. I'll call her by the name she introduced herself with at our first dinner, which was formal and slightly too long, Marianne, at a work conference in 2019. They dated for 18 months and got married at a venue outside of Naperville that cost more than my first car and my second car combined. I paid for a third of the wedding. I didn't blink. He was happy. She seemed to make him happy. That was enough. But something shifted after the wedding. Slowly at first, the way water damage works. You don't notice it until the wall is already soft. The Sunday calls became monthly. Then they became texts, usually sent at odd hours. Usually something brief like, "thinking of you," or "hope you're well." Phrases that are technically communication but feel more like a form being filed. I started to feel like a checkbox on a to-do list. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself this is what happens when your child marries. Their life reorganizes around a new center of gravity. You adjust. You give them room. You do not become the kind of mother-in-law who calls too often and makes things difficult. So I didn't call too often. I sent birthday cards. I mailed Christmas gifts. I drove 6 hours to Chicago for their housewarming and slept on the pull-out couch in the office because the guest room wasn't finished yet, and I did it cheerfully because I was grateful to be included. The first time I really noticed something was wrong was Easter 2021. I had driven up, as I always did. Marianne's parents were there. Lovely people from Barrington, her father a retired orthodontist, her mother very thin and very particular about wine. I had brought a ham and a sweet potato casserole. Marianne's mother had brought a charcuterie board and 2 bottles of something French I couldn't pronounce. At dinner, Marianne's father made a toast. He thanked everyone for being there. He said something about the new chapter Adrian and Marianne were beginning. He looked at me briefly, the way you look at a piece of furniture when you're acknowledging it exists. After dinner, while I was in the kitchen washing dishes, I always washed dishes. It was something I could do, something useful. I heard Marianne in the hallway say to her mother, in a voice that wasn't exactly quiet, "She just shows up and takes over." I don't know how to explain it to her. I kept washing dishes. I didn't say anything to Adrian that night. I drove back to Columbus the next morning, telling myself I had misheard. Or misunderstood. Context, Sandra. You don't know the context. But I started paying attention after that, and the more I paid attention, the more I noticed. I noticed that when Marianne's parents visited, there were photos on Instagram. When I visited, there were none. I noticed that my suggestions about the neighborhood they were looking at, about the contractor they were considering, about anything really, were received with a particular kind of polite silence. That meant we've already decided and your input wasn't requested. I noticed that phone calls I made to my son were often answered by text an hour later, but when his mother-in-law called, I knew because he mentioned it, he picked up immediately. I was being edited out, slowly, carefully. The way you remove a word from a sentence until the sentence still makes sense without it. The money thing started in 2022. Adrian called me in February, actually called, which should have been my first warning, and said he and Marianne were thinking about buying a building, a mixed-use property on the northwest side. Commercial space on the ground floor, 2 rental units above. They had the business plan, they had a property manager lined up. What they needed was a co-signer on the commercial loan because Adrian's debt-to-income ratio was slightly high after they bought the house. Just your signature, Mom. You wouldn't be on the hook for anything. It's a formality. I knew better. A co-signature on a commercial loan is not a formality. I was a bookkeeper for 25 years. I understood exactly what it meant. But this was my son. So I asked to see the business plan. He sent it. It was reasonable. The numbers weren't perfect, but they weren't alarming either. I signed. 6 months later, he called again. The ground floor tenant had backed out. Could I lend them $40,000 to cover the gap while they found a replacement? Just for a few months. He'd pay me back with interest. I had $40,000. I had spent 30 years being careful so that I would have $40,000. I lent it to him. He paid back $12,000 over the next year and a half. Then the repayments stopped. When I brought it up gently, he said they were going through a cash flow issue and he'd get back to me. Then Marianne called, not Adrian, Marianne, and said that the loan had put a strain on the relationship and she hoped I wasn't going to make it worse by pressuring them. I remember standing in my kitchen after that call thinking, I am owed $28,000 and I am being asked not to pressure anyone, but I didn't push. Because Adrian was still my son. Because I believed in him. Because some part of me, the part that had washed dishes and driven through ice storms and held everything together for so long, still believed that if I was just patient enough and generous enough and easy enough to be around, eventually things would go back to the way they were supposed to be. In the spring of 2023, Marianne's parents helped them buy a vacation property in Michigan, a lake house. I saw it on Instagram. I was not asked for a co-signature or a loan or anything at all. I was not mentioned. I was not invited to visit. In August, I asked Adrian if I could come up for his birthday. He said it wasn't a good time, they had a lot going on. I said of course, no problem. I baked a chocolate cake, his favorite since he was 8, and ate 2 slices by myself in my kitchen in Columbus and then put the rest in the freezer, which felt about right. In October, I got a card in the mail from both of them. A printed card, the kind with a stock photo of autumn leaves, signed Adrian and Marianne. My name was spelled correctly. That was the most personal thing about it. And then November came. And the voicemail. We need space. It's not healthy for anyone. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that. Long enough that the light changed. Long enough that I noticed I was hungry and then decided I wasn't. I thought about Raymond, which I do whenever things get very hard. Not because it helps exactly, but because he was the person I used to talk to about hard things. And even after all these years, the habit of turning toward him is still there. I thought about what he would say. Raymond was a quiet man, not given to speeches, but he was fair in a way that cut through noise. He would have looked at me over his coffee cup and said, "Sandra, what are you waiting for?" I called my attorney the next morning. Her name is Patricia. She's handled my estate planning since 2018. Small firm, very thorough. I told her what had happened. I told her I wanted to review my will and my trust documents. Now, I should explain something. After Raymond died, I was very careful about the future. I had watched his mother lose everything because she had no plan, no documents, nothing written down. I swore that would not happen to me. So I had a will. I had a revocable living trust. I had beneficiary designations on everything. I had worked with Patricia to make sure that whatever I built over the course of my life would go where I intended it to go. Adrian was the primary beneficiary of the trust. Had been since 2006. Patricia walked me through my options, quietly and without judgment, which is exactly what I needed at that moment. We talked about the loan, the $28,000 still outstanding. We talked about the co-signature on the commercial loan, which I was still technically liable for. We talked about what I wanted the next chapter of my life to look like. I told her I wanted to be free. We spent 3 weeks going through everything carefully. I was not acting out of anger. Or maybe I was, a little. But I was also acting out of clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when you stop hoping things will go back to the way they were. The kind that arrives when you finally look straight at what's in front of you instead of what you wish was there. I removed Adrian as primary beneficiary of the trust. I updated my will. I restructured the loan as a formal debt, documented, legal, collectible, rather than a family arrangement. I consulted a second attorney about the co-signature and learned what I needed to know about limiting my exposure going forward. I did not tell Adrian any of this. I texted him once, 2 weeks after the voicemail, just to let him know I was doing well and I hoped they were too. He replied 4 days later, "Good to hear." Thanksgiving came. I drove to my sister's house in Dayton and ate too much cornbread stuffing and played cards with my nephews until 11 o'clock. It was a good day. A genuinely good day. I noticed, somewhere around dessert, that I hadn't thought about Adrian in several hours, and instead of feeling guilty about that, I just thought, good. Christmas was quiet. I was fine. In January, Patricia sent the finalized documents. I signed them on a Wednesday afternoon at her office, shook her hand, drove home, made soup for dinner, watched the news, went to bed. I don't know exactly what happened on their end or how they found out. What I know is that on a Thursday in late February, my phone started ringing at 8:14 in the morning. Adrian. I was in the middle of my second cup of coffee and a crossword puzzle, and I looked at his name on the screen for a moment before I set the phone face down on the table and went back to the puzzle. He called 4 more times before noon. Then Marianne called twice. Then a number I didn't recognize. I answered that one out of reflex, and it was their financial advisor, a man whose voice was doing a very poor job of concealing how alarmed he was, asking if I had a moment to discuss some paperwork. I said I would have my attorney follow up with him and ended the call. By the end of the day, I had missed 31 calls. By Friday evening, it was 47. On Saturday morning, Adrian texted, "Mom, we need to talk. Please, this is serious." I looked at that text for a long time. I thought about the Easter dinner, the voicemail, the $28,000, the Instagram photos from Michigan I was never in, the birthday I spent alone with a chocolate cake, every Sunday call that became an every other Sunday call that became a text message filed like paperwork. I typed back, "I hope you have a good weekend, Adrian." And I put the phone in a kitchen drawer and went outside to check on my garden. I want to be careful here because I know what this story sounds like from the outside. It sounds like a woman who cut off her son out of spite or out of grief, dressed up as practicality. People will have opinions about that. People always have opinions about mothers. But here's what I know. I know that I gave that boy everything I had, not because I expected repayment. I didn't, not really, not the financial kind, but because I loved him. And when you love someone, you pour yourself into them and you trust that love is enough to hold things together. I know that at some point, without my fully noticing when, I stopped being his mother and became something else. A resource, a contact on a form, a liability to be managed and then set aside. I know that the voicemail, "I hope you understand," was the moment I finally understood something myself. Not that I was being discarded. I'd known that for a while, honestly. But that I had a choice about what happened next. That I could keep being patient and generous and easy and small, waiting for something to shift. Or I could stop. I stopped. And I'll say this, because it's true even if it's uncomfortable, the paperwork wasn't revenge, it was self-preservation. There is a difference, even if the result looks the same from the outside. The trust is still intact, it will still go to someone I love. My niece, my sister Ruth's daughter, who drove 3 hours to help me clean out my gutters last fall and never once mentioned it was an inconvenience, she's named now. I've set aside a separate education fund for my grandchildren if I ever have any, structured so that it bypasses Adrian entirely and goes directly to them. Because whatever their father becomes is not their fault, and I refuse to punish children for the choices of adults. I also left detailed instructions, a letter to be opened at the appropriate time, explaining everything, not as accusation, just as record. So that someday, if anyone wants to understand what happened, they can. The full picture, not just the version where the old woman overreacted. Some days I'm completely at peace with all of it. I sit on my back porch in the evening and watch the light go off the garden, and I feel genuinely fine. Better than fine. Lighter than I've felt in years, actually. Like I put down a very heavy bag I'd been carrying so long, I'd stopped noticing the weight. Other days are harder. Adrian's birthday is in March, and this year I bought a card at the drugstore out of reflex, held it in my hands for a minute, and then put it back on the rack and walked out. I sat in my car for a while after that. I'm not going to pretend that was nothing. I think about who he was at 11, crying in the shower because he missed his father. I think about the afternoon he graduated from Ohio State, and I cried all the way through the ceremony, and he was embarrassed and also, I think, a little pleased. I think about how he used to call me every Sunday, and how those calls used to be the best part of my week, and how somewhere between that and here, something got lost that I don't know how to name. That grief is real. I'm not pretending it isn't. But I've also learned, at 64 years old, that loving someone and excusing someone are two different things. That being a mother doesn't mean being infinite. That at some point, you have to look honestly at what a relationship actually is, not what it used to be, not what you hope it will become, and decide whether what it actually is right now is something you can live with. I couldn't live with it, so I didn't. I'm still in Columbus. I still have my roses. My sister Ruth calls every few days. I started volunteering at the library on Tuesday afternoons, helping adults who are working toward their GEDs. which turns out to be exactly the kind of thing that reminds you what mattering looks like when it's simple and clean and has nothing to do with money. Adrian hasn't reached out since the weekend of the 47 calls. That was 3 months ago now. I don't know what that silence means. I try not to read too much into it either way. What I know is this. I gave that voicemail one word, and that word was honest. And then I took care of myself, which is something I should have done a long time ago. Sometimes the quietest answer is the truest one, and sometimes understanding something completely is the bravest thing you can do. I've thought a lot about why it took me so long not to make the phone call to Patricia. That part, once I sat down at that kitchen table and really looked at what my life had become, wasn't hard. What took a long time was getting to the table in the first place. I think about the version of me that drove through freezing rain to get Adrian to that hospital, the version that built a business in a spare bedroom so my son could go to a good school and not start his adult life underwater. That woman would not have recognized what she eventually became. Someone who accepted being managed and minimized and quietly moved to the edges and called it love. That's the thing nobody talks about honestly enough. How generosity, when it isn't met with basic respect over a long enough period of time, stops being generosity and becomes something else. It becomes an arrangement. And arrangements don't require gratitude, just maintenance. That was what I had become to Adrian and Marianne, something to be maintained. Kept functional. Kept at a distance that was convenient for them. The 47 missed calls told me everything I needed to know about what our relationship had actually been built on. Not the calls themselves, the timing. 3 months of near silence and then 47 calls in a weekend. That's not love reaching out. That's not love reaching out. That's someone checking on an asset. I'm not bitter about it, I mean that. Bitterness would require me to still be waiting for something different, and I'm not waiting anymore. What I feel is closer to the strange, tired relief you get when you finally clean out a room you've been avoiding for years. It's a little sad when you see what was in there, but the room is clean now. What I've come to understand at 64 is that integrity isn't just about what you do for other people, it's about what you refuse to do to yourself. There's a version of integrity that looks like sacrifice. You give, you hold on, you absorb, and for a long time I thought that was the only version that mattered. But there's another kind. The kind that says, I see the situation clearly, I am going to name it honestly, and I am going to act accordingly. That kind is harder. It doesn't feel noble in the moment. It feels cold and a little frightening, and very, very final. Adrian made choices. Not one big dramatic choice, but a long series of small ones. Every call not returned, every boundary Marianne drew that he didn't push back on, every time he looked away from what was happening to his mother and decided it wasn't worth the discomfort to address it. Those choices accumulated. That's how it works. Nobody loses their mother's trust in a single moment. They lose it slowly, one small decision at a time, until the distance is so great that a voicemail from his wife feels like the natural conclusion of something that had been coming for years. I removed his name from the trust because it was the honest thing to do. Not the satisfying thing. Not the strategic thing. The honest thing. The trust is a document that says, these are the people I love and choose to protect. Keeping Adrian's name on it would have been a lie I was maintaining for the sake of a relationship that had already quietly ended. I still love my son. I want to say that plainly. That love doesn't go away, and I wouldn't want it to. But I've learned that love without honesty isn't really love. It's just attachment wearing love's face. And I've had enough of arrangements dressed up as something warmer than they are. Ruth called last Tuesday. We talked for an hour about nothing much. Her garden, my garden, a book she's reading. At the end she said, I'm glad you're okay, Sandra. And I said, I really am. And I meant it. That's enough. For right now, that is genuinely enough.